Hello and welcome back to Entering the Infinite, the Magic the Gathering podcast, all about infinite combos. And as always, I'm your host, Aaron Bennick. After two Innistrad sets back to back, I don't know about anyone listening, but I love Innistrad. Not only is it a fantastic plane full of werewolves, vampires, ghosts, all that kind of stuff. I love that stuff. Halloween is my favorite holiday of the year. Innistrad has major Halloween vibes to it. It's got some great cards in it. It's fantastic. But not only that, Innistrad makes me nostalgic because I started playing Magic when Shadows over Innistrad actually came out. I played during that standard. I played during Eldritch Moon, Amonkhet, all of that. And I had such a blast playing with the Shadows over Innistrad cards. So getting to go back to Innistrad is super nostalgic for me. I think so many of the cards are super good. We finally get a werewolf commander. I'm so excited about that. I'm definitely building Tovolar. But I'm not here to talk about Tovolar today. I'm actually here to talk about two completely different Storm commanders that could work or could not work in two very different ways. Both Innistrad Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow came out with a fantastic Storm commander. And today, I'm going to be talking about both of them, kind of comparing them side to side, seeing what the pros are, what the cons are of both. So, without further ado, let's hop into it. Now, I'm gonna talk about the one from Midnight Hunt first, and you might already know which one I'm talking about. It is Lier, Disciple of the Drowned. So Lier is 3 blue for a legendary creature, human wizard. Lier is a 3/4, and Lier reads: spells can't be countered. So any spells, both yours and your opponent's, cannot be countered. Lier also says each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback. The flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. So before I kind of get into the meat of the episode today, or before I even start talking about anything really, I'm going to just go over the other one from Crimson Vow, which is Eruth, Tormented Prophet. Eruth is a blue and a red for a legendary creature, also a human wizard. Eruth is a 2/4, however. And Eruth says, if you would draw a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library instead, you may play those cards this turn. So, first impressions, right off the bat, let's start with Lier. Lier, first of all, has 2 fantastic abilities. So first of all, spells can't be countered. This may seem like a downside in mono blue, except for the fact that blue actually has a significant amount of cards that let you kind of pseudo counter spells in the same way that Remand would. For instance, we have Divide by Zero from Strixhaven. We also have Unsubstantiate, also Narset's Reversal. All of these cards essentially put the spell back in our opponent's hand, which means that they could cast it again, but it is the best way to just get counter magic in a Lier deck. There are also, I believe, a couple of blue cards that exile cards on the stack. There is Summary Dismissal, there's Ashiok's Erasure, so there are still plenty of ways for you to be able to kind of counter spells, but it shuts off all of your opponent's counter magic. And then each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback, meaning that you can just basically cast all of your spells twice. You cast them from your hand and then you cast them from your graveyard. That's an incredibly powerful ability. So one of the reasons why I think Lier works as a Storm Commander, first of all, is because of that second ability. You get to reuse all of your cantrips and essentially everything. So you get to double up on all of your Storm count, even casting a Storm spell more than one time. Meaning you can Mind's Desire for 10, and then Mind's Desire again for 11, and then you have 21 triggers of that. or you can brain freeze someone for half their library and then brain freeze them again to do the other half. So I think that Lier just has a super big amount of utility to him. And then Eruth, Tormented Prophet. So Eruth does have red, which means that you do have access to more cards, and you also have access to rituals, which is really good. Those are always important for a storm deck. And if you would draw a card, exile the top 2 of your cards of your library instead. So it's not 100% draw. You're not actually getting any real card advantage. But the reason I think that Eruth works really well as a storm commander is, first of all, because of the red. But second of all, because all of your cantrips, your opts, serum visions, preordains, all of that turn into essentially draw 2 cards that you can only play for that turn, which is super good for a storm deck because you can just keep casting spells over and over and over again, and then you just keep exiling more cards. It's a little bit harder to kind of keep that tempo if all you're doing is drawing cards. That's why, for instance, Yidris is a really good storm commander because all of your spells have cascades, so you'll double up on all those storm triggers. But Eruth getting you 2 cards instead of 1 for all your cantrips means that your cantrips are all doing double duty. So that's why I think that Eruth would also work really good as a storm commander. So instead of doing a deck tech, because for this week I was really deciding. I wanted to do an Innistrad commander. I didn't know which one I wanted to do. I didn't know if it should be Lier. I didn't know if it should be Eruth. They're both really good. They can both be really good storm commanders. They're both new. They're both flashy. They're both fancy. And then I decided, why not just do an episode with both of them? So instead of a full deck breakdown like I normally do, I'm going to be going over the pros and cons of each of these guys. That way we can kind of see what both of their strengths and weaknesses are and see maybe which one is the better storm commander. So the first, I'm going to go over Lier first. So the first pro that I have of Lier is obviously giving the graveyard flashback. So for all of my guys that enjoy playing Modern, you might be very well aware of the card Past in Flames and just how important that card is to the engine of Modern Storm. I actually play Blue-Red Gift Storm in Modern, so I know how important Past in Flames is to that deck. Without it, the deck is just significantly weaker. Being able to catch each spell for double the storm is a fantastic ability to have in the command zone. And as we all know, the graveyard in Commander, especially, is more often than not actually an extension of your hand because so many Commander decks actually just have the graveyard, have access to the graveyard so then they can just play whatever else they have in their hand. So a Muldrotha deck could have 20 or 30 cards in their hand when in reality, they only have 3 actual cards in their hand. But if you have Muldrotha out, you have access to your entire graveyard. And it's the same here with Lier. So with Lier, sometimes when you're kind of starting to run out of gas a little bit, Lier lets you extend your hand into the graveyard so then you can cast that, preordain for a second time. Maybe start setting up a little bit better, drawing the right card to kind of get that to kind of keep that momentum rolling. That way you can continue with your storm turn, and just having each of your cards essentially up your storm count by 2 means that you almost need a lower storm count in some aspects to actually finish the job on your opponents. So for instance, with something like a Brain Freeze mills 3 cards and it has Storm on it. So if you cast a Brain Freeze, but you're only able to take out 1 person with it, if your Storm count isn't high enough, well, Lier then lets you cast that from your graveyard to kill at least a second person, and then maybe somehow you can get it back from your graveyard, and Archaeomancer, something like that. You can cast it again to do on the third person. But much like Tendrils of Agony needs a significantly less storm count because it actually does double the damage of something like a Grape Shot. So just having access to your graveyard and being able to double your storm count up is super good, especially in a mono blue deck. One of the really good cards to be able to cast twice is a High Tide, which, if you don't know what High Tide does, High Tide is a single blue for an instant. Until end of turn, islands tap for double the mana, essentially. So paying 1 mana to cast the High Tide and then tapping another one, floating one already to cast High Tide again, means that all of your other lands tap for 3 times as much mana as they normally would. So being able to cast each ritual twice in mono blue is a really good ability, especially since blue doesn't have access to the mana geysers and the dark rituals of the world. So having something that provides you any kind of additional utility, which is his ability to flashback the whole graveyard, is just super good, especially to have in the command zone. So another really good pro of Lier is the fact that Lier doesn't actually let spells be countered. Now, this might seem like kind of you have to build around it downside, but if you really think about it, it just means that you can go completely uninterrupted on your turn, or anyone else's for that matter, if you have the ability to storm off at instant speed. But essentially, instant speed removal can and will interrupt your storm turn, sure, but you don't have to worry about any kind of counter magic at all. So if your opponents are tapped out, they don't have enough cards in their hand, they just don't have any removal, you are safe to proceed with your storm turn. We have the ability to build around Lier's restriction of spells can't be countered by using cards like I mentioned earlier, Unsubstantiate, Summary Dismissal, those kinds of things. But our opponents don't have the ability to build around that. I mean, sure, you could put Summary Dismissal and Unsubstantiate in your deck, but those aren't nearly as solid as just regular Counterspell and Arcane Denial, and people aren't going to start running those other kinds of cards just because Lier pops up. So there are still plenty of pseudo counters blue has access to that can still be used to your advantage, and your opponents can't actually use any of their counter magic that they bothered packing in their deck. So Lier weirdly has really, really good protection for you for your storm turns. And even if someone does have some kind of instant speed removal, you still have Unsubstantiates, you still have Narset's Reversal, all those kinds of cards to be able to pseudo counter your opponent's spells and just continue with your turn. So, unfortunately, with pros, there always must be cons. So some of the cons that Lier has is, the first one is that, first of all, Lier is mono blue. Most of the rituals are in either black or red. Now, blue does have some pseudo rituals. So for instance, you've got Twiddle. You have Turnabout. I think Turnabout is a absolute must-have in this deck. You've got High Tide, which I mentioned. Frantic Search, kind of a little bit. Hidden Strings. You also have Snap, which untaps only 2 lands, but if you've got, say, an Ancient Tomb, then you're gaining mana on that. You kind of have pour over the pages. It makes things pour over the pages kind of makes itself cost less because it untaps lands, but you're actually losing mana on that exchange. Blue has access to actually like a lot of really weird rituals, kind of. One of the ones that I found while kind of researching Lier was a card called Drain Power. So Drain Power is blue and blue for a sorcery, and essentially drain power makes any player tap all their lands, and then you gain all of the mana that player has. Now, the way that it's worded, if the player taps all their lands in response, you still get all that mana back. So you can drain power someone and then drain power a second person, because Lier lets you cast it from your graveyard. So with drain power, you actually have a pretty powerful ritual. One of the other ones that I found is called Piracy, and it is also blue and blue for a sorcery. And it says, until end of turn, you may tap lands you don't control for mana. Spend this mana only to cast spells. So for whatever reason, this card is actually really high up in price. It's like almost $30. But blue has a lot of these really weird rituals that are like Piracy, where you kind of use your opponent's lands for stuff. But the issue with a lot of them is that if I cast a Piracy, all of your opponents can just say, hey, if we all tap our untapped lands, he doesn't get any mana. So all of your opponents can just tap all their lands in response, and then you don't actually get to do anything with Piracy. So blue has, all these really weird kind of rituals, which is kind of a shame, because Lier can struggle quite a bit with actually generating enough mana to cast enough spells to win the game, aside from any kind of dramatic scepter lines. I think if you're going with a dramatic reversal Isochron Scepter kind of just mana generation for your storm turn, then you're perfectly fine. But without that combo and enough rocks to generate infinite mana, you can actually have a hard time casting enough spells without sufficient mana. There are quite a few spells, though, most of the ones that I mentioned, that I think are powerful enough with the right build to be able to generate enough mana that you can get off a really good storm turn with Lier. But definitely, though, I do think that is a downside of Lier, the fact that he doesn't have black, or the fact that he doesn't have black or red, to be able to include some of the rituals in order to be able to generate enough mana to win. Another downside is just the fact that Lier gives you access to the graveyard, but he also has to stick around on the board for it. Lier's ability is an incredibly powerful one, but to be able to actually double your storm count, Lier has to 100% stick on the board, meaning that the deck could be very susceptible to removal. It also kind of works in the same way if you think about using Lier as just counter magic deterrent, because if someone just removes Lier, then your opponents can just counter all of your storm spells, and then you're kind of in a pickle. So then you have to wait another turn and recast Lier, and they might remove it again or just counter it while it's in a stack, and it's kind of a whole thing. So while Lier's abilities are very powerful, they're only very powerful if he does actually stay on the board. So, as per usual a lot of commander decks kind of go downhill without their commander. But I'm still pretty confident that if you build Lier correctly, the unsubstantiates of the world, then you can just return those removal spells back to your opponent's hand and just continue. All right, so with Lier kind of broken down a little bit more, let's talk about Eruth. So, the same way that I broke down Lier, I'm going to break down Eruth a little bit more. So, pros and then cons. One of the best pros about Eruth, and this is why she's even in consideration for being like a really good storm commander, is the fact that Eruth gives you access to twice as many cards. So, Preordain, 1 blue mana, draw 2 cards, essentially. opt 1 blue mana, essentially draw 2 cards. Even Ideas Unbound. Ideas Unbound now reads 2 blue mana, look at 6 cards, and you can play any of those cards, which is so good. Eruth has the ability to supercharge cantrips and make them give you twice as many cards for typically about half as much mana. So, the usual kind of mana to card ratio is about 2 mana to 1 card, aside from any kind of cantrips. So paying 1 mana for access to 2 cards is way above that rate. And then if you continue to kind of go up the scale, so you've got, your Ops, your Serum Visions, Preordains, Ponders, all of that stuff. They are all 1 blue mana, look at 2 cards, and cast either of those cards. But as you kind of go up the chain, Chart a Course is now 2 blue mana, look at 4 cards. You do have to discard a card from your hand, but you get to look at 4 other cards, which is so incredibly good. Continuing further up the chain, you've got Hieroglyphic Illumination. 4 mana, look at 4 cards. I almost didn't do my math right there. But you can see why that ability would be so good for a Storm turn, because if you cast a Preordain on like a Storm turn trying to set up, and you just draw into a land, then you're kind of bricking there because you drew something that wasn't useful. But if you've got Eruth and then you Preordain and you exile a land, but you also exile like a ritual or another cantrip, then you're still giving yourself gas. So not only does Eruth give you access to twice as many cards, but she also lets you filter through kind of the bad sections of your deck by letting you have access to twice as many cards for about the same rate. So, lands, mana rocks, removal, card draw, these are all essential parts to a commander deck. So with Eruth out, all of the cards that you're using to just try to calculate storm count and kill your opponents, all of those cards, you can use those to then filter through all the bad ones. So your Talisman of Creativity or Curiosity, whichever one the blue-red one is, you don't have to cast that on your Storm turn, and it's exiled. You just don't have to worry about it on your Storm turn. It's not a dead draw if you just draw it. All of your lands aren't dead draws, and it's just such a good ability, not only because it gives you access to more cards, but because of the filtering. Not to mention that any kind of wheel is absolutely insane with Eruth. Wheel of Fortune is just 3 mana to draw 14 cards, which is absolutely ridiculous. Windfall could be twice as many cards. Like, oh, that is so insane. And I think that is so good for a Storm deck because you just get so much more gas. You just have access to so many more cards. You can pick and choose which ones you want. Untapping on turn like 4 or 5 with Eruth already out, and you just windmill slam a Windfall, and you just put 14 cards face up. You get to pick out of all 14 of those cards what you want to play. And if any of them are more card draw cards, then suddenly you're putting more cards into exile, and you're, casting more rituals. You're filtering through more of your library, and it's just so good. It's such a crazy ability, especially with wheels. So easily, that is the best pro that Eruth has is her ability. And it might be like, oh, well, yeah, that's why you would play her is because of her ability. But just reading it without kind of thinking about it, you might not realize just how good that ability is by just supercharging all of your card draw spells and just being able to look at twice as many cards and get that much needed filtering. So the second pro that Eruth has is definitely the inclusion of red. Adding red gives you access to most rituals. And this is kind of part of the reason why like I wanted to do the Lier versus Eruth thing, is because Eruth has access to red rituals. Lier does not have access to red rituals. So you're going to struggle a little bit more to make a lot of mana in the Lier deck, but you might not struggle as much in the Eruth deck because Eruth has red. So you have access to mana geysers and desperate rituals and pyretic rituals and Rite of Flames and seething songs and all of that stuff. Even Brass's Bounty, dude. Like that card is still good. So just continuing to add mana in order to keep casting spells and exiling cards with Eruth is absolutely crucial. And being in red means you get access to so many of these crucial rituals. So you preordain, and then you exile an opt and a desperate ritual. You cast the desperate ritual. Now you have more mana than you had originally. So not only that, but getting all of red's rituals means that when you're kind of starting to bottom out, you're kind of losing gas, then any of the rituals that you've exiled, you can then start to just cast all of those rituals from exile and then cast all of the other card draw spells from exile. So the addition of red with Eruth, definitely a pro. And as I've said before, if there are pros, there are cons. One of the biggest cons of Eruth is impulse draw is not the same as an actual draw. So what this means is impulse draw is essentially a lot of what red does, which is like exiling the top card of your library, and then you can only cast that card this turn. You can cast it the next turn, or you can cast it for as long as it remains exiled. Things like that. For instance, Atali Primal Storm has impulse draw on it. Whenever Atali attacks each opponent, exile the top card of your library, and you can play any of those cards for as long as, or without paying their mana cost. Sorry. But impulse draw is not the same as actual draw. So you do get 2 cards off of that preordain. However, you don't get access. You don't get to have more cards, because if you don't use those cards, you're going to lose them. So with Eruth out, if you don't have enough mana and you cast a preordain and you exile a land and let's say Brass's Bounty, you don't have enough mana to play the Brass's Bounty, and you've already played your land your turn. You can't play either of those cards. They stay in exile, so you can't use them. So that is definitely a very, very big downside to this ability, because if you just don't use those cards, then you don't have access to them anymore. So this makes whiffing on a storm turn absolutely brutal, because you don't have access to those cards ever again. There isn't something that you can do to put those cards back in your deck, or put them in your graveyard even, or put them back in your hand, or be able to, recast them from exile or something. So losing, really important rituals, losing tutors, losing key storm cards can make the entire thing go topsy-turvy. So while Eruth is definitely a really good card by giving you access to twice as many cards, she's also a little bit bad in that same sense, because if you don't use those cards, then you lose them almost immediately. So she really almost has to be out just on the turn that you plan on storming off. She isn't really a value card in that kind of sense. She is really just a storm enabler, because she just gives you access to twice as many cards. So really, if you're not careful with Eruth out, then you can lose so many important cards that you actually really need access to. One of the other very important things to note about Eruth is that her ability is a replacement effect. So Eruth says, if you would draw a card instead, exile the top 2 cards of your library, you may play those cards this turn. So you don't actually get any real card advantage when you try to draw a card with Eruth out, because you don't get more cards in your hand to be able to set up or do what you want with. You get access to 2 cards for a sole turn. And while that ability is fantastic to see twice as many cards, if she's out when you're trying to set up for a storm turn, you have to forfeit any and all cards that she can possibly exile. So if you're not ready to use any of the cards that you exile immediately, then you just lose access to more cards, and that's storm count down the drain, that's mana from rituals down the drain, cantrips down the drain, tutors down the drain, all that kind of stuff. So with Eruth out, there's not really any, I'll cantrip a little bit to try to fill my hand, filter out lands, that kind of stuff in order to set up for a storm turn. If she's already out, then you already need to be trying for that storm turn, because she's just going to make you lose all of those cards. So in reality, you really actually just want to keep Eruth off of the board until you're 100% ready to actually take that storm turn. Otherwise, she's just going to actually be a bane to you, and she's going to exile cards that you don't want exiled, and she's going to actually make you lose steam because you're not putting any additional cards in your hand. So now that I've kind of gone over both Lier and Eruth, the question remains, which is the better storm commander? And I think the answer to that question is neither of them. I don't think that either of them is so much better than the other that you would 100% want to play one over the other undeniably. So, for instance, Kess Dissident Mage. Kess Dissident Mage gives you red and black and gives some cards in your graveyard flashback. So Kess is an undeniably better storm commander than both of these, but we're not talking about Kess. But there are things about Kess that makes her better than both of these just off the bat, and there's not really any argument to that. But for both Lier and Eruth, there isn't really any argument either for one or the other that makes one significantly better or worse than the other one. Eruth lets you see twice as many cards, but Lier gives you access to twice as many cards. So they both kind of do the same thing there. Eruth has the ability to give you red, which means that you have access to all of these rituals. But with Lier's ability to recast a bunch of blue rituals, you might not need access to all of those red ones. I just feel like they're so different and yet so similar that it's hard to determine which of them would be better and which one of them would be worse. For instance, Lier is really good with High Tide because you can cast High Tide twice. But Eruth is better with just any card draw because you get to look at twice as many cards with Eruth. So it's really hard to kind of narrow down which of them would be better and which one of them would be worse and which one of them you should actually pick to play. Well, my opinion on which one is better and which one is worse is it's hard to pick. It's hard to pick. I thought I was gonna have some kind of revelation there where I was gonna be, oh, it's Lier, or oh, it's Eruth, but no, it's honestly it just is hard to pick, and it's because both of them are so powerful in such different ways, but also very similar ways, because they both give you access to twice as many resources, which is exactly what a storm deck wants. So you really wouldn't go wrong with either one of them, because they both have fantastic cards to use to your benefit. So for instance, Lier has access to Secrets of the Dead, which is an enchantment. Whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, you draw a card. That is a fantastic spell for that deck to keep Lier going. Lier lets you cast all your storm spells for twice as much. Lier lets you cast Turnabout, untapping all your lands. He lets you cast High Tide to untap all that stuff. He lets you cast Mind's Desire twice. Maybe Mind's Desire is exactly what you need to get out of it. Not to mention, Lier and Windfall are really good. Lier and Windfall, Lier and Fact or Fiction, because all of those cards that are going to your graveyard, you still have access to all of those cards. So you really aren't losing out on anything of that kind of sort with Lier. And then with Eruth, you get access to, like, a really good card that works good with Eruth is the Moonveil Regent. Whenever you cast a spell, discard your hand. If you do, draw a card for each of that spell's colors. Well, with Eruth out, you're not drawing those cards. You're actually just exiling them face down. So at a certain point, you're not even discarding cards. You're actually just adding to your exile pile. Not only that, but Eruth works great with things like Burning Inquiry. Each player draws 3 cards, then discards 3 cards at random. You just have access to 6 cards. And then if you're empty-handed, you don't discard anything. Or something like Breakthrough. One blue mana, draw 4 cards. You're exiling 8 cards with that. Careful Study, you're exiling 4 cards. There's just so much good stuff with both of these commanders that it's really hard to pinpoint just which of them is more powerful, because they both have their pros and their cons. So, just some closing thoughts here. Lier is, I think, for the Storm players that really just want some additional value. Maybe you want to add a little bit of creativity to your next commander deck. I think that's where Lier shines, because he gives all of your spells in your graveyard flashback, so you get to reuse all your stuff. So maybe sequencing is a little more important, or maybe Windfall is a very good card in your deck. And you get to play with all of the really weird rituals that only blue has, and that you would only play if you are in mono blue. Not only that, but building around Lier's spells can't be countered ability is incredibly interesting, because you get to actually play with a lot of very strange pseudo counter magic, and you get to leave yourself protected to a lot of stuff that your opponents might be doing. And then you've got Eruth, who is absolutely fantastic, because she lets you get access to twice as many cards, which on a Storm turn, as I've said over and over, is incredibly good, because it's just that kind of added filtering. And she adds red, which means that you get access to the really good rituals, the really powerful rituals, and the really big ones. But at the same time, her ability is a little bit of a build around, but it's also a very interesting build around. Things like goblin lore work really weirdly with Eruth. And who knows? Maybe all you do is you just put Lier in Eruth, and you kind of have the best of both worlds, right? And you just have that amazing Innistrad themed amalgam of a deck that lets you look at twice as many cards and use your graveyard twice as much. But enough about me and what I think about these commanders. I want to know what you think about these commanders. Are you going to build Eruth? Why are you going to build Eruth? Why pick Eruth over Lier? Are you going to build Lier? And why pick Lier over Eruth? I want to know what your reasoning behind each of those is. I want to know why you would pick Eruth over Lier, or why you would pick Lier over Eruth. And then maybe we can get down to the bottom of who actually is the better Storm Commander. Because in my opinion, it's just too tough of a choice. As always, thank you very much for listening, and tune in next time when we enter the infinite.